Hey guys, long time no video. Sorry about that. This week we're talking about labels. So, I'm sure that most of us have heard, either when talking about our gender identity or our sexuality, or maybe other identities or labels that we identify with, that, something like, oh, why do you have to label everything? We're all people, and it's just you're just trying to be special and special snowflake, and, it really doesn't matter, if both genders or all genders are equal, then why does it matter what gender you are, or stuff like that. So people really don't see. The thing is, people who say that, they're not against labels in general. They are only against labels that they don't usually have to deal with in their everyday life. Because there are plenty of labels which they do deal with in their everyday life that they use and are happy to use, and they realize, they know that those labels are useful in their own way. For example, no one in my life, and I'm pretty sure it will never happen, has ever, come up to me or replied to me in conversation if I mention that I'm American. They never say, why do you have to label yourself? We're all human. It doesn't matter what country you're in or whatever. And it's like that's never happened to me because, nationality is pretty much a universal thing that people think about or talk about every day, even if it's not, in a direct way. Generally, people are used to that label, and they use it themselves, and they see how it's useful, but they don't think of it as a label because they just think of it as, part of their identity that they don't have to, it's for them, it's the default, so they don't have to present their label. I guess a label, is sort of a word or a short phrase that describes part of your identity or how you identify, but it's, it's in a way that it's public, it's social. Of course, it's possible that you identify with a label and you never tell anybody or talk about it, but the reason why the label was created in the first place and why those words exist, whatever they are, is so that people can communicate with each other. So a lot of the people who, dismiss labels, you can just reply to them with labels that they identify with and say, these are labels too, you use labels too, so why would you criticize me for using labels? They may not be labels that you're used to, and it may be hard for you to accept them or whatever, but that's not because it's a label, that's because you have a problem. And if you think about it, what's the difference between a label and any other thing that we identify with? I guess the difference is probably how, a label is something that is sort of it's what other people see you as, or you want other people to see you as. Because, if I didn't have any labels to describe my gender identity, I would probably just think to myself, I would probably just describe it in my head as I have my own gender identity, which is distinct from the other two most popular gender identities. But, it's just, when you're communicating with someone, and even when you're thinking to yourself, those ideas, if you want to put them in words, it's just so much easier to say, I'm non-binary, or I am not a man or a woman. They're all labels, but yeah, basically, some people, you don't have to label yourself. A lot of people like labels because it really helps them both to, find a community and communicate with other people about their identity and how they feel about it. And it also just makes them feel more secure in their identity. And, language is really important, and it's an important part of human society. And, having words for an important part of our life, even if we only use the words in our own head, it can be really helpful. Some people don't want to label themselves. Like, for example, they may not want to label their gender identity. And that's fine too. Like, whatever, the labels are meant or were created to help people. So if they don't help you, then that's fine. Of course, there's the tricky situation where you would like a label, but you don't know what label to use, because you don't know how you identify, or you just don't know, which label is better. And, me, when I was questioning my gender identity, whether I was non-binary or not, I wanted to label my gender. I wanted to identify my gender and then have a label for it. And it's like, but I couldn't, because I didn't understand, my feelings, and I was just trying to figure it out, and it was so confusing, rifling through my own head. But, when I did come to the conclusion that I am not a girl, and I realized, no, okay, there's, what I am is non-binary. That's a word that describes what I am. And I'm sure of it. And that just really, it was just really relieving for me. Like, yeah. And, now I'm sort of, okay. In the past, in some of my videos, I've talked about how I'm still questioning exactly what my gender identity is, if I'm gender fluid or not, if I'm just non-binary and not gender fluid. I have one static gender. But, that questioning process, is a lot less disturbing than the initial one, because I do still have, like, the label of non-binary, and I know whether I'm gender fluid or not, either way, that label still describes me. And it's just good to be able to just categorize my feelings. It really helps. Another thing about labels is when people give you labels that you do not want, either because they are derogatory or because they just don't fit you. Now, that's a bad thing to do to someone. Like, it's basic. If it's a derogatory label, then it's basically just calling them names. And if it's a label which they don't identify with, if people, if they know, they should not label you in ways you don't want to be labeled. But of course, it's not always practical or safe to tell people how you identify or don't want to identify. So, for example, if you're being misgendered as a binary gender, and so that would be a label which doesn't apply to you. So it's like, but the thing is, if you say that you don't want to be labeled that way, because of the way society is, you know, the idea you're either a man or a woman, and, you know, whatever gender you are is very important. In that situation, you basically can't reject the label without choosing a new one. And in that situation, there's a whole load of risk that comes with that. But it could be, you know, a different situation where you might not like the label someone is using for you is, for example, if you identify as pansexual and people or someone is referring to you as bisexual. Now, the meanings, you know, usually the way people use them, they use them to mean the same thing or almost the same thing. But there are pansexual people who really do not identify with the label bisexual, and there are bisexual people who really do not identify with the label pansexual, even if the person who is using that label to describe them means, you know, it means the same thing to them as how that person identifies, but it's like the label, for whatever reason, you don't like it. And that's totally valid. Another example, you know, I've heard of is like Black Americans saying that they don't really want to be called African American because that's sort of not anymore. Like, recently the politically correct term, I think I have a feeling it's going to change, but like, you know, 10 years ago the politically correct term for Black people in America was African Americans. And so, but I've heard, you know, people say, you know, people say that, you know, they don't identify as African American, they identify as Black because they are not from Africa and their parents are not from Africa, so they don't really identify with being African. And, you know, if white Americans can just be called white, you know, they're not really called European Americans unless, like, they literally come from Europe or their immediate family comes from Europe. So it's like, why would you call Black Americans African Americans? So there are, you know, there are Black Americans who feel that way, even though when people say African American or Black American, they mean the same thing. You know, it's just, it can come down to connotation or context or whatever. Note, I personally identify as both African American and Black because, you know, my parents are from Africa, and if my parents weren't from Africa, if I didn't have recent family who came from Africa, I really don't know how I would identify. It's interesting. But I would be such a different person. Like, my mom's nationality and culture has really impacted me, so it's really hard to imagine how I would identify in that case. But I'm getting on a tangent now. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about labels. Do you as viewers have any interesting, like, thoughts about labels or experiences with your own labels or other people's labels that you'd like to share? Feel free to comment. Oh yeah, and so right now we do have one member for every day of the week, which is great, but we're looking for 2 extra members for the weekend so that we can have a little leeway. Like, if someone misses a video, then you know, one of the weekend people can step in or something like that. So basically we have 2 open spots. Feel free to apply. You can, the best way is to either send your video, your application video, to our Tumblr or to email it to us. But it's better to send it on Tumblr. It's easier for us, I think. It's easier for me anyway. Anyway, I hope everybody's doing well. I hope you don't think too much less of me for missing so many videos. And, yeah. I'll put links about the applications into the description. Bye.